Hello, everyone, and welcome to this German Marshall Fund event entitled Europe in Disorder, NextGen Perspectives on the Future Role of NATO, hosted in collaboration with the US mission to NATO. My name is Annika Vollmer. I'm Program Coordinator at the Brussels office of the German Marshall Fund. Over the past 7 decades, the United States and Europe have been each other's closest allies. Russia's war in Ukraine is testing this durability of peace. Both sides of the Atlantic will have to make a greater effort to ensure the vitality of the partnership and the permanent stability in Europe. The extraordinary NATO summit, starting tomorrow, will be an opportunity to send both a clear message of NATO's unity and solidarity and strengthen NATO's deterrence and defense capabilities. The upcoming strategic concept to be adopted in June 2022 will need to consider the ever-changing global security environment. With this event, we hope to offer a voice to young professionals as they represent both tomorrow's leaders, but will also have a stake in shaping the future agenda of the transatlantic partnership. And with that, it is my pleasure to welcome our speakers today. For one, Juxhina Gjoni, President of the Youth Atlantic Treaty Association, Cori Fleser, non-resident fellow at Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security at the Atlantic Council, and also Manfred Wörner Seminar alum, as well as Danielle Piatkiewicz, research fellow at EUROPEUM Institute for European Policy. As we only have an hour, let's jump right in with the opening statements. You each have a couple of minutes to offer your perspectives on the future role of NATO. And in the meantime, I'd suggest that participants use the Q&A function below to pose all of your questions to our speakers today. And so with that, Juxhina, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Annika. Good afternoon to everyone joining us today, and good morning to our audience across the Atlantic. First of all, let me thank the German Marshall Fund for extending this invitation to the Youth Atlantic Treaty Association, and it's an honor for me representing YATA in this webinar. And as we also had the chance to mention it before, I'm very, very proud that this is a webinar with all women in this environment of security and defense. Right at the cusp of the end of an old strategic concept era, NATO allies and partners are being challenged by an unprovoked and unjustified war as it coming from the Russian Federation against Ukraine. And for sure, the world order and the security in Europe, but not only, will not be the same anymore. And the post-Cold War and the international order we know so far has radically changed. After many doubts, I would like to say, of a lack of unity among the European countries and the US across the Atlantic, I will say that this war taught us how united the United States, NATO allies, the European Union, and all democratic aspiring countries can be and can stand all together in unity, condemning a war these years. First of all, this current war showed how fragile the Western democracies are and the liberal values are. It was a harsh lesson, I would say, for everyone to not taking democracy for granted anymore. None of us has foreseen this war coming, and despite all the disinformation campaign, the lying, the denials coming from the Russian Federation, our alliance showed again, as I mentioned, unity within itself, but also with its partners, bringing the EU and US closer than ever. And I would like to say that taking into consideration the new strategic concept review, what we know about the game theory of deterrence through nuclear weapons in either preventing conflict or going to war is little convincing nowadays. Deterrence, as we knew, based in the assumption of rational actors taking rational actions, has been broken down. NATO now will have to refrain its future tasks ahead to the Madrid summit in a sense of finding new ways how to predict and encounter security issues beyond its borders. It's not very pleasant, but coming from a country like Albania, in the Balkans, I was used to hear how Balkan countries were called the backyard of the European Union when organized crimes or communism regimes or fragile democracies emerged just on the backyard of the European Union borders. Now, what NATO allies should look after is exactly the new ways of projecting stability and preserving security just in their backyard. And I'm referring not only to Kosovo, Serbia, but also the unrest in Bosnia and Herzegovina, for example. And ahead to Madrid summit, but also to tomorrow's summit, NATO allies will be dealing also with a new security architecture, and what was once set in the reflection process of the strategic concept review will be needed to be revised as much as setting which are the new alliance opportunities and challenges. This might bring to a new potential and new process of enlargement or not. But if we look at Finland and Sweden, we can say that although they hold their neutrality during Cold War and afterwards their neutrality toward defense alliance, it never meant that they were neutral toward democratic values or our transatlantic values. That said, driven from the rational fear coming from the Russian Federation war against Ukraine, a lot has changed, and everyone has the right to pose a simple question: what's next? And in this rational fear and, let's say, rational question, is found also the rising percentage in the polls and in the opinion of membership or not in NATO for Finland and Sweden. But at the same time, I would like to also press attention and say that more attention should be given also to the Balkan region, for example, for its eventual threats to security. Countries left aside both the European Union but also NATO poses a huge threat to the security of the whole continent of Europe. And not forgetting to reiterate the new natural will of the population, for example, in Kosovo to join NATO as well, driven not only for a rational fear, but also mainly of the war they had to fight back in 1990s. Another consideration to be taken into account in the near future of NATO is also the spillover effects that the withdrawal of NATO presence has beyond its borders. And if we take, I would like to just skip a bit from Europe and go in Afghanistan, for example, and we also saw the spillover effects that the Taliban's takeover of Afghanistan had not only within its border, but for the whole Europe with the migration flows, but also beyond of it. And just to make a parallel of this, the alliance will have to pay close attention to not turn the withdrawal of NATO forces and presence in the future into a second crisis, also in the Balkan. And I have in mind here K4, for example. We all just few months ago experienced also the game of powers of Serbia and Russia, for example, in the northern borders of Kosovo. Just to conclude, I would like to mention that in its line of adaptation towards new emerging security threats, NATO's most important, let's say, action was in 2016, right in the aftermath of Crimea's annexation, and it was the establishment of enhanced forward presence battle group. I really like to stress the importance of EFP battle group, because it didn't only demonstrate that the alliance stands united to respond to any security threat in the Baltic Sea region, but nowadays more than ever, this establishment is in fact serving as the wire to not cut or to not trespass, the one that is holding the Russian Federation outside the alliance borders. I would like to say that representing a youth association as Yara it is very important for the youth members of this association to be part of these webinars and these discussions, because many countries that compose our association are dealing with different security issues or challenges. We would like to mention a lot fake news and disinformation campaign, which is rising nowadays. But Annika, I would like to thank you and pass it over to you for the next speakers, and I'm here open for the Q&A session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Juxhina. And I think I couldn't agree more with your last comment about involving more the younger generations and the younger voices amongst us. And I'm sure we can get back to Balkans and how NATO should approach that region. I think it's very important, especially in light of what has happened with Ukraine. I turn to you, Cori, for your comments.
Excellent, thank you. So good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Hello from Washington, D.C. My name is Cori Fleser, and as was mentioned, I'm a non-resident fellow with the Transatlantic Security Initiative at the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. The German Marshall Fund also nominated me to be part of the NATO 2030 Young Leader Group as part of the Secretary General's NATO 2030 reflection process in 2020, excuse me. So thank you again to the German Marshall Fund for that support, because that was an incredible experience. And if you haven't yet read our report, we deeply encourage you to do so. It was developed by 14 different young professionals from across the alliance and really reflects some next generation perspectives of NATO's role in the future. And, up front, I always like to offer a caveat when I speak on next generation panels, because, I know that we are a wildly diverse generation. We span a very large series of decades where our demographics are very different. I'm always happy to share my perspective, but obviously our perspectives are uniquely shaped by where we come from, the countries we represent, and the upbringings that we individually have had. And so I think this is a very important context to remember in any of these conversations, but it's also why it makes these next generation conversations so powerful and impactful, because we're able to share these different experiences on the role of NATO in the future. So a few of the characteristics that I think really unite us as a generation and really are helpful to remember in the way that we think about NATO is that, many of us already know we were that generation that grew up after the Cold War during an era of NATO enlargement. This uniquely shapes our perspective about the role that NATO played and continues to play. We also we've known a NATO that has been mostly engaged in operations in Afghanistan and Iraq. And then we saw some of the involvement in the Balkans, but we really know this Iraq and Afghanistan experience to have shaped NATO. We've grown up with an EU. We didn't inherit an EU. We sort of know this to be another major entity inside of Europe, organizing different European partners and the role that it plays in juxtaposition and coordination with NATO. And we're also so much more connected with each other across either side of the Atlantic than previous generations. And sort of the speed of information sharing allows us to have that connection with each other across the Atlantic to share information on what's going on. This has been both a good thing and a bad thing, maybe in many ways. But at the same time, I think this connectivity with, easy access to information right on our iPhones really does characterize a lot of our generation as well. And so, I think, ultimately what I've also noticed through many of the conversations that I've had, and this is just some of my personal experience, is that, we tend to look at security a little differently than older generations. Our generation tends to look at more inclusive, holistic and comprehensive forms of security, and sort of what we recognize and appreciate the traditional threats and security threats of state and non-state actors. We're also looking at other destabilizing effects of climate change, human security issues, and of course, first, front and center in our minds right now is a global pandemic. And so that certainly shapes what security means to us, I think, as a generation. And so I always really reflect on this context of us being a very diverse demographic, but also one that has some core unifying aspects that really shape our perspective. And I think maybe, up until about 4 weeks ago with the Russian Federation invasion of Ukraine, that this conversation may have sounded slightly different because we were initially talking about kind of these these questions of what is the role of NATO, and they were a little existential in nature. It was like, is NATO still relevant, and what will NATO look like in the future? And so when I was reflecting on putting my comments together today, I've really thought about this in two different ways. I wanted to highlight a little bit my thoughts on how I think the Russian Federation invasion of Ukraine will shape the future of the alliance, and then also just generally speaking, what NATO's role should be in the future. That to me sort of, it's like, I see these things as almost two separate parallel structures, because we are so in the middle of this crisis. We don't know what it's going to look like at the end now. So it's really hard to predict and sort of anticipate. But at the same time, there are these underlying conversations that have been happening for years now and leading up through to, the strategic concept development coming up soon, that are still ongoing and definitely still warrant a discussion as well. So I think with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I really think that we've seen NATO's role and value as an alliance still become very relevant and useful. It's very, I think we've realized that this is an example for our generation that says this is the role of NATO. This is actually what it was designed to do. And we see this example now that we're in a professional environment. And we can really directly link that to some of our professional endeavors, whereas before we might have only seen this as something that our parents or older generations dealt with. So I think this is a very unique way of shifting the conversation. We've definitely seen allies collectively imposing sanctions. We've seen this sort of like coordinated effort to contribute humanitarian and military assistance. I think, we've seen a collective stance to uphold international values and follow international humanitarian law that, we know it was part and parcel of NATO, but, we're seeing this front and center in conversations in the news, especially. We've seen the plans to activate responses and deploy forces should Russia trigger a NATO response. And then we've also seen, coordination and deconfliction with assistance being provided, by the EU or by NATO or through the different allies. And so this is something that I think really reinforces the role of NATO inside the Euro-Atlantic zone and harkens back to this place where it originated, where it is this collective security entity to secure the Euro-Atlantic region. And I think we're seeing that front and center in real time right now, given Russia's involvement in Ukraine. I think this brings me to my next point that I wanted to talk about, which was what do we see NATO's role going in the future? And I often find that this conversation centers on how to balance NATO's role in addressing threats emanating from outside the Euro-Atlantic region with NATO's role in addressing them. And there tends to be some tension between our generation and older generations of, is it appropriate for NATO to engage outside the Euro-Atlantic zone? Should we be working with partners in the Asia Pacific, for example? What does our role look like in the Middle East and North Africa? And I know these conversations continue to go on even with this near-term crisis in Ukraine. NATO has always been an adaptive organization, and I think there's a healthy tension there that needs to be reflected upon. And so, I'd make 3 points about where I think I see NATO adapting for the future, just based on my perspective. The first is that I'm a big proponent of continuing this understanding and expansion of a holistic and comprehensive approach to security. I personally work on the women, peace and security and human security agendas. I'm currently dabbling in climate change. But there's this really sort of acceptance of, like, when we look at NATO in the future, in its roles as this collective security alliance, these things are certainly part and parcel of what we need to include, even if they're going to emanate from outside the Euro-Atlantic zone. What NATO is responsible for, its approach to the political military adaptation, I think it can really account for these different sort of what are called non-security threats and issues, or non-traditional security threats and issues, even though I think some of us might actually consider them traditional security as we keep discussing them more and more. I don't think this necessarily takes away from NATO's tasks of collective defense, crisis management, and cooperative security. I think it really does expand the alliance's understanding of different security threats that might actually require those actions. The second point I'd say is that we often talk about NATO's role with strategic competitors, which has historically meant China and Russia, and China being sort of the near one. And then we're still sort of confused or thinking about what the role of NATO should be vis-a-vis China. And I think this remains a hard question even now. But I think this is also where NATO's expanding and or strengthening of its partnerships with like-minded democratic countries in the Asia-Pacific comes into play. I'm specifically thinking of, political consultation or practical cooperation with countries like Australia, Japan, New Zealand, South Korea. And I don't think that this forces NATO in a position where it's sort of following the US into the Asia-Pacific, so to speak, even though I recognize the US has definitely tried to sort of shift some of these conversations in its role. But I do think that NATO, in its role as a global affairs and international security entity, the way that we are so interconnected, the way that we can't sort of ignore what is going on outside the Euro-Atlantic zone, I think this using the partnerships framework allows us allows the alliance to really investigate how to understand this challenge of China in particular, without really overcommitting anything. I think that's sort of this healthy balance when we start talking about the partnerships and political consultation pieces. And then finally, for NATO to adapt and be relevant in the future, I think, and maybe this is a plug for our entire purpose of today, we absolutely do have to engage and incorporate the perspectives of the next generation. And I'm not just simply talking about Europeans and North Americans here, but I'd also encourage engagement with younger generations in Africa and the Middle East as well. And, to my point earlier about the Asia-Pacific region, the organization itself, its allies' missions, the different military delegations will benefit from younger generations who have these sort of core anchoring points of our generation contributing to the alliance. That will be absolutely important and paramount for how we shift the alliance internally in the future. And, if the assumption remains true that threats from outside the Euro-Atlantic zone will ultimately influence what goes on inside of Europe, destabilizing or not, I think it will absolutely be helpful to hear from other younger generations outside the Euro-Atlantic zone to hear their perspectives of how they view those threats, because this might be very helpful contextual information for shaping and understanding the response or the challenge. So I will stop there. Thank you again for the opportunity to participate in the panel, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Cori. I think you gave us some food for thought, especially some insightful comments on sort of the differences in perspective of how we understand security, but also how we see NATO, and maybe also that sort of shift that's maybe going on in the post-Cold War generations. And with that, Danielle, to you now.
Yes, of course. Thank you for having me today. It's always great to be back with GMF. I spent several great years with GMF. So I also want to start my intervention today with your point about the generational aspect of NATO. And this is very much going to echo Cori's comments, but as you put it, our generation will have to navigate the challenges that we face today with Ukraine well into the future. Our perception of NATO and what it stands for has and will be shaped dramatically by these events. And we'll also see how NATO adapts as a security provider. We've seen NATO emerge and kind of evolve at the moment as its original state of a product of World War II, a deterrence mechanism for Cold War, and the engagement until now has been mainly an out of area of operations. I know Cori touched on this before, but the closest we can compare would be Bosnia and Kosovo in the 90s, which of course transformed NATO even at that time. But while Russia has used Kosovo to justify its interventions in multiple cases, these cannot be calculated in the same effort. But what we do see now is that since 2004, NATO's troops have only previously been used to respond to national disasters, to coordinate the departure of Afghanistan in 2021. So we're seeing for the first time NATO deploying its rapid force, 40,000 troops to fortify Europe's borders in response to war in Ukraine. And so this will significantly change and alter NATO's role, whether we realize it or not. So today we revisit the initial reasons why Central and Eastern Europe countries in the 90s stressed the need to become a member of NATO, primarily to rebuild military capabilities, interoperability, and create that security buffer with Russia. So my research at EUROPEUM, I look primarily at how V4 countries, so the Visegrad 4, how they're collaborating together on security and defense cooperation. And while I can't agree more on Cori that this definitely shifts with generational memory, I think the Central and Eastern European partners have very similar mindset when it comes to dealing with Russia. than compared to the transatlantic region. And while they may have diverged on issues around strategic autonomy, rule of law, energy, migration, but matters around security tend to be aligned, and I will say with the little caveat of Hungary at times. And this is primarily even more so now with the Ukraine threat, especially with Russia. The threat of Russia and Ukraine. That has always been the case, even in the early 2014s. So that said, the support that we've seen with Europe has been outstanding, but bilaterally, the V4 countries have really stepped in for the military support of the region, both with Poland on humanitarian and military aid. Czech Republic has increased military support, Slovakia on many fronts, including notably with NATO, the Patriot systems, which will be part of the new NATO battle group in Slovakia. So we've also seen a bit of a 360 on migration policies from formerly harsh opponents like Poland and Hungary. And we're likely going to see increased defense spending, which Poland has already well established the 2%, but this will definitely help rejuvenate and also encourage the other member states, and especially in Central Europe, to kind of get into gear in that sense. But I will say the fears in the region remain that this will not be the last conflict. There's potential threats in other regions and other neighboring countries, and this, of course, the domino effect and what is going to happen after this, even in the years to come, is very palpable in the region. So these will be issues that we're definitely going to need to look at for Central and Eastern Europe. And what we see is even Biden going to be doing a visit in Poland this week, reconfirms the US and NATO commitment to the region. But really the big questions still remain, for both US and NATO, is what will be the red line for engagement? Will it get that far? And how can NATO create avenues for more support in Ukraine without triggering full engagement? So just to kind of then transition to a little bit more of looking at the future role of NATO, we've seen that they are constantly adapting to new security challenges. We have seen this over the years with more, present, even just language and acknowledgement of China as a strategic threat. We've even seen the role of NATO stepping up when it comes to COVID, changing and shifting its function with humanitarian and medical support. But these changes have accumulated to a readaptation of NATO goals and strategy. And what we've been discussing in the last couple of speakers is the strategic concept. But while it's going to continue to outline the essential core task, which is collective defense, crisis management, and cooperative security, what we're seeing now is that it's no longer a concept. It's now a fully functional roadmap on how NATO members will need to act and adapt to this new security environment. We are seeing issues elaborated in the security concept. Now, I'll just use an example of emerging and disruptive technologies, which we're seeing in full effect, at this moment in Ukraine. So while this, these disinformation tactics and data breaches and cyber attacks are happening here, the strategic concept will now have to take on a new breadth of realistic, objectives to try to counter. We've never seen really at this scale and in this nature. So right now we're both very aware that traditional warfare and tech warfare will be part of our new security reality, and the strategic concept in NATO will need to adapt to that. We're likely to see these same priorities outlined ahead of the Madrid, same concept as reconfirming of the alliance's shared values and principles, adapting to strategic reality. But I would say really moving forward, and just to kind of conclude on the main points, would be, we really need to reinforce existing mechanisms within NATO, but then also not be afraid to revisit what's not working and how do we readapt this. To look beyond NATO and also further establishing partnerships, especially in terms of democratic partners, not just in Europe, but globally. They even outlined in the strategic concept establishing stronger ties to democratic fellows like within Asia, South America, including Australia, Japan, and South Korea. These are all vital in countering geopolitical threats, not just from Russia, but also from China, that we still cannot keep, lose our eye on, especially and be distracted primarily with the ongoing conflict. So lastly, I would say we need to understand how we got to this point as well to be able to prevent a future security threat in the future. And I think we also just need to remember what Central and Eastern Europe was going through in the 90s. This is essentially the same, and we cannot fail where we were able to succeed there, but we can't fail in the future. So those are kind of my notes. I wanted to end on a more positive note, but hopefully we can do that towards the end of the conversation.
Thank you, Danielle. And I mean, you've already addressed sort of this sort of adaptability of NATO and how we have to reinforce sort of the existing structures, But we also have to look at the ones that do not work, as you said. And this brings me sort of to my question, because we are looking now at the strategic concept of that's coming out in June, and considering sort of the ever-changing security environment we're looking at and the unpredictability of some of these challenges. It's sometimes also difficult to sort of look into this glass ball and come up with like a very coherent and comprehensive concept or strategy, right? And so I was wondering then, what do you think are sort of the main points of contention in the transatlantic partnership? And when it specifically comes to security matters, of course, but sort of where could potential disagreements arise when we're talking about the strategic concept? I don't know who would like to have a first stab at it.
Maybe just to quickly respond to some of those points. And I think it goes beyond, as we see, NATO has also taken on a larger force beyond just a traditional security provider. I would say the issues around rule of law and of course, defending democratic values is something that needs to also be addressed. And unfortunately, I feel like right now, a lot of the issues that were happening within Poland on these very specific current infringement laws that the EU is enforcing. So I think we can't be distracted too much as well. There are these underlying issues within certain countries that need to also be addressed. And I think within NATO, kind of, handing that carrot, if you will, to try to make sure that some of these countries that were going a different trajectory really be able to rebound and course correct, because now is the time. I think what we've seen is what happens when authoritarian, regimes get any type of leeway, they will go in full force. So if they see any fractures in the system, that's an area that I think NATO allies can really be able to support each other on and really keep each other accountable.
I'm happy to jump in because I think I've said this before, but with the strategic concept, policy documents are only as good as insofar as they're implemented. And so I also appreciate that there's a limited word count that is available on the strategic concept. And so there are many topics inside of NATO that will simply not get the word count that they require in order to sort of advance their agenda farther. And so I think it's sort of an important thing to remember that we're going to have this probably forward-leaning strategic concept come out. It's going to be illustrative of what the alliance will likely try to shift towards, but then how that document is then used to shift the organization itself to actually implementing what it's identified and overcome some of the hurdles. I think that will sort of be the test, if you will. Sometimes with these documents, they include so many different things that where it starts to get difficult for shifting the organization of itself to actually implement those different things it wants to take on. Sometimes we risk backsliding into what is comfort, what is easy, what we already know how to do, and then it takes the adaptation process slightly longer. So I think it'll be really interesting to see how the strategic concept and what is included, even if the word count is small for different important topics that we're looking towards, we still take that guidance and are able to shift the alliance and actually implement the direction it needs to go.
I'm happy also to jump in. So first of all, we will all firstly have to see what's the direction of the new strategic concept, because more to predict, it's like a strategy of how to deal with the new emerging security threats. What, in my opinion, is very relevant is the commitment of all allies and the new partners toward the transatlantic bond, the transatlantic values, and mostly the democratic values. And I would like to emphasize it, what democracy and what democratic values means for every country, because we have new democracies like in the Balkans, for example, but also in Eastern Europe, there are some shades of democratic setbacks. So the level of the commitment and engagement of the all allies and partners is very, very much very important to this point, to the involvement of the strategic concept, but also to the implementation of it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your comments. And I think sort of what we addressed, or what you addressed in your opening statements, of sort of the many issues that fall under our understanding of security. So whether if we talk about health or food or trade, they're all sort of increasingly framed, at least in our generation, I feel like, as security concerns. And I was wondering, how do you perceive these challenges, and should NATO and does NATO address them adequately? And if not, how can they improve, basically?
I will jump in here. So with the pandemic, NATO allies and gave a very important lesson to the rest of the world and its members. It showed that through its diplomatic actions, NATO also can be a stronger partner for humanitarian aids and to come in help to those countries who could not afford the economic effects of the COVID-19 that we all have suffered from this way. So some call that the ventilator diplomacy, some call them just diplomacy, but it was an important and positive lesson of the humanitarian role aid that NATO can have beyond the traditional aspects of collective defense and security. Thank you.
I'll just jump in because I think one thing that comes to mind is NATO's role with climate change and climate security, and really taking on this as a key element of the alliance's work. You know, I think we're starting to see NATO try to figure out how to address the impact of climate on its military capabilities, and how climate impacts can actually degrade military capability and effectiveness. I think we're also looking at the impact of militaries on the environment around it. We know that installations, equipment, we know that war and conflict is actually quite bad for the environment. And so trying to think through the impact of that with NATO and what it's able to do. And then I think finally, you know, and this is a little bit more difficult, is understanding the impact of climate change on destabilizing effects that ultimately impact the Euro-Atlantic zone. We know that the destabilizing effects of climate are going to drive people in and through and around the world. We know that this impacts migration. We also know that this impacts food and health security issues. And so I think it's you know, it's a really interesting element that NATO has taken on with its climate change agenda, because these things will ultimately be very front and center, I think, over at least the next decade, if not farther.
Cori beat me to the climate-related security risks, but I'll switch to maybe what you know, one of my other earlier comments was on emerging disruptive threats in the term of technologies. As I mentioned, we see it, you know, firsthand today, and this is actually something that NATO SecGen Stoltenberg was addressing on how the cyber dimension is increasing within NATO and being focused on both within hybrid tools, trying to understand how hybrid conflicts are working. So this is a very unique opportunity, and I hate to use that word, but it's a way for us to get an insight on how far and these technologies can be used, and how our, you know, regimes like Russia using this technology for both, you know, within their country, but also externally. And then also what are some of the tools to be able to counter this? What we see is kind of, I think people were calling it like, you know, fighting from your desk, fighting from your computer. Like it's just as important to create these systems in place to help give a voice, but also a platform for dissidents to be able to counter disinformation, for example. So we see some amazing examples happening kind of on the spur, but if we could actually be able to harness and understand how this technology is going to be used, meanwhile knowing that it will constantly be updating and changing and shifting, just like all security threats. So this is just an area that I think NATO definitely needs to focus. And even if they go beyond the word count, just kidding, Cori, but if they stay within the word count, but it is an area that also it intersects almost all military and security and defense areas, whether it's on migration, on, you know, disinformation around that, or even, as I said earlier, COVID, there was a lot of misinformation there. So I think this is just it's an area that will definitely be continued to be developed within NATO, and also, of course, all member states, and seeing how the transatlantic alliance can really, you know, do lessons learned on how to be able to combat this in the future.
If I just may, Annika, jump in right here, I would like to also, for example, share the experience within the Youth Atlantic Treaty Association. We have dealt with a lot of disinformation campaign, and I will go in line with what Danielle, but also Cori said before. There are a lot of disinformation campaigns, and what NATO countries should be dealing with is not to talk about NATO in traditionally terms, and to shift the narratives to the next generation. And this is a very important webinar to do so, and to shift the attention of a military or political alliance, but toward the youth and what security and defense means in terms in a smarter way, in order to make it more understandable also to the youngest generation, because we all speak very in a comfort zone within ourselves, but when we go beyond this network and this audience, it is very difficult to make people understand what NATO is and why it's important. So maybe there should be to press more attention also to this task, let's say it this way. Thank you. To you, Annika.
Thank you, Juxhina. I think you gave me an excellent segue to one of the questions that have come in. So about representation and who do we give a voice to and how. And so the question is basically, is there an issue in ensuring that the minority political parties' viewpoints in NATO member countries be adequately represented and reflected in NATO deliberations and decision-making? So I think maybe Juxhina or Cori or Danielle, any of you all have addressed sort of who do we give our voice to and the importance of it. So I think all of you probably have something to add to that.
I think just to maybe even just go back to a little bit of, I would say history, but not so long history ago, where you had conflicting viewpoints on NATO's role in, assisting the United States in Afghanistan and these interventions. So you have seen kind of internal debate, and I think it's an incredibly healthy debate. We've seen this debate, of course, on expansion, on new members, so I would say I see this happening. What has been very shocking is how unified, and I know, Juxhina, you mentioned this early on, is how unified members have been on the situation in Ukraine. So I don't see an issue with to that degree, to the point where it needs to be, it has always been there. People has always had their decision, and I think that's kind of how NATO alliance has worked. I don't think that's an area that needs to be altered dramatically, but of course, I think it's still important to make sure that everyone has that platform and that voice. So I think to also remember that what we see now has not always been in the past. So it's actually really unprecedented times, and I would say in the positive side there.
Maybe I just offer that I agree with Danielle's points, because I think we're at a real turning point here for where with the situation that we're experiencing in real time in Ukraine is really driving unity and alignment, I think, across a variety of different political persuasions. I think even in the US, you're seeing a really cohesive support for supporting Ukraine, where before we might have had tension between our two parties in the United States with support to NATO in general. And so I think this is a very interesting point that we're experiencing, where as we try to elevate and increase, different types of views, I think the views that we're talking about increasing are different perspectives from different lived experiences, but I think they're all aligning towards this international human rights norms, rule of law, democratic values. And I think we're really seeing a more of a shift of alignment across the political spectrum, if you will, but then making sure that within this pursuit of democratic values, people's individual and lived experiences are reflected in some of the decision making. And so I'm hopeful to see that, that is sometimes a generational shift that doesn't happen overnight. That's not something that can be captured quite quickly and succinctly in a strategic concept. But I think when we look at what the alliance stands for and what it wants to stand for in the future, I'm hopeful that this is some of the changes in perspective and attitudes and norms that we'll start seeing.
Yeah, just to jump in, I would like to go in line with what Cori said, and I would like to take some exemption. For example, in Albania, there is an extremely positive perception on NATO, on the European Union membership importance, etc., and so on. But for example, if we take into account that Finland or Sweden, there were these pros and cons of the membership into NATO. But what Cori said, when it comes to the values for what NATO stands for, then it becomes more easier also for let's say the new opinions of what NATO stands for. It's not just that a defense and security alliance and provider, but it is an alliance that in its fundamentals has the democratic values. And so when it comes to the values, then the unity is much more evident than the pros and cons, let's say.
Thank you. We have also received another question, sort of going back to the security architecture in Europe. And here a participant is asking, how will Germany's new defense spending help enhance the European security architecture? I think we're already seeing sort of, I mean, it goes back to this unity we're seeing. And I think a lot of people have seen this momentum happening, and maybe it will influence it in some way. But I was wondering, what do you think about that?
Yeah, just to, I press it, but okay, I will go. So in my opinion, increasing the GDP from the 2% of every country, but not only of German, emphasize, let's say, NATO's allies' commitment toward the defense and security tasks that the allies has as a collective defense and security provider. It is in the spirit of the Washington Treaty to emphasize and to make it a stronger alliance. So strengthening this point and increasing the GDP, it will also make not only Europe but the whole alliance a stronger partner to deal with security challenges and threats, not only within its borders, but also back to you.
I maybe say, just because I had already alluded to it, you know, with defense spending kind of already increasing in certain areas, or at least being hinted that it will be increased. But you also have countries, and I mentioned before, as Poland, who is, you know, already kind of exceeding the 2%. I think it goes beyond, of course, the 2% debate, but it's also more of what can countries do also together, I would say, through existing programs, through whether they join battle groups, whether it's, you know, sharing technology, creating more investments and being able to do that. So there are other areas. So I would say the 2% increase is helpful, but I think that there's other ways that member states, if they're not able to meet that, to recommit. And I think we're seeing that across the board. So I do think it's a big step for Germany in that phase, especially because of new leadership. That I think it was quite a big stance, but it does set a good tone, I think, for other member states to chip in, if you will, a little bit more.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on the last point that Danielle made, because I think, you know, when we look historically at Germany, they are a leader in NATO and also the EU. And I think this shift right now to say we're going to increase our defense spending when traditionally they had been a little bit more reserved about it, is a huge signal to other European nations and really to NATO about sort of the importance of the alliance, the importance of Euro-Atlantic security, and sort of, you know, backing that up with different types of commitments. And so I think it's a really impactful and powerful signal, given the role that Germany has played in Europe over the last few decades.
Thank you. And I definitely agree with you, Cori. I think it does have a big impact on sort of how other countries will react. And it's very interesting to see that there's not only the 2% debate, of course, there's also how there are other ways in which countries can contribute to NATO. There's another question in the chat regarding energy and dependency on Russia. I guess it sort of also goes back again to Germany, but I think most European countries are experiencing it currently. And she's asking who can be alternative sources of energy suppliers other than Russia, and what is the current status of Nord Stream 2 projects? Now, maybe the last question is very specific, and I'm not sure if maybe Cori, if you have some insights there, but yeah.
Well, I think those energy discussions are a really interesting one, right? Because it really shows how interconnected we are as a global community where, you know, even if we had energy dependencies on Russia, I know that there were definitely discussions from the US side of the house of how to release the sort of dependency on Europe from Russia by being able to augment and provide from other types of energy sources that we ourselves control or even are controlled from the Middle East. And so I think this is where we start seeing that there is an active conflict going on in the Euro-Atlantic zone that has this energy and economic dependency piece going on inside of Europe, but that the global network of energy can actually sort of offset this other element of addressing the conflict. And so I unfortunately don't have a great update on Nord Stream. I cannot answer that one directly, but I think when we think about energy dependency, these are some of the things that I've found like particularly compelling and interesting, this interconnected nature of energy and energy security.
And I mean, it's also, to just jump on that, was the energy security aspect of it. I think we're realizing how important and vital this infrastructure is. And so having these viable alternatives, I mean, I know for NATO, it's more on the security side of that, but it's also just purely a resource issue as well. I would also just, remind that there, of course, are other existing infrastructures out there. And I would just use the 3 Cs initiative, which specifically looks at, how can energy be kind of interconnected between, parts of Europe. So they have these areas, and hopefully some good responses come through the international community, and both in security, but also in economic stances on how we can try to mitigate some these current reliances, but also the future. So so no answer on Nord Stream 2, because I think it updates on a daily basis. I'm sure there's people, full-time watching on just what's coming out of that. But, that step in itself, I think also just signals the political unity and a reaction that I think we needed. So that's kind of the most I have for there, as more on the political side, and also what are some of the alternative structures that we have in place that we can rely on.
Juxhina, would you like to add something still?
Yes, I will just go after what Danielle said, that more despite the fact that the alliance and the partners are looking for alternative solutions, that they might have also found some, but I will say that more attention should be pressed to the commitment of the alliance to undertake these measures, and their will to use and to develop alternative solution to the energy supplies. Thank you, Annika.
Thank you all. And I am aware of the time as we are close to the end of our session. So I think I might just I would like to give each of you an opportunity to give us some last minute closing remarks. Maybe something a little bit hopeful, something positive to end the session with. And Danielle, I think I'll start with you.
All right. Yes, happy to end on maybe also just more of a reflective tone. As I was driving through, and because of that, more of a regional generational perspective of, kind of understanding how Central and Eastern Europe, like this is a very sensitive and at home issue and topic just because of historical relevance. But I actually was just going through some old books from my time at GMF, and I came across Ron Asmus's book on looking at NATO and the open door policy, and the struggles, the behind the scenes that those countries had to go through in order to become a NATO member, but seeing how much countries really saw NATO as the beacon, as that security umbrella. I really think we can't ignore, post situation in Ukraine, how much it means to countries to be part of this community. So I would just say, like, really, let's remember what the NATO purpose is. And try to remember that as we make these decisions, both, current leaders, but also future leaders.
Thank you so much, Danielle. Cori, can I turn to you?
Of course, gladly. So thank you again for inviting us to speak to this panel. It's always a pleasure and always happy to do so. I think it's always illuminating. I learn something every time we participate in these conversations. So thank you again to GMF for organizing. I think, I would conclude on another sort of personal reflection of mine. And NATO is an organization that we, this next generation, have inherited. We are inheriting it. It is going to be our organization because ultimately those who work on it now will retire and we will sort of rise through the ranks and be part of NATO. I'm always really motivated to see the different types of people who are interested in these issues. I recently attended a NATO defense conference with future leaders on transatlantic security issues. And I was so inspired by the knowledge and the passion and the motivation of people for, one, their own issue areas within these transatlantic security issues, but also their motivation to change and to sort of shift things to have a positive impact on the world. And so I know it sounds cliche, but I genuinely, I sort of reflect on that constantly, that there's a rising generation of future security leaders who are deeply passionate about these issues. They know that they're inheriting the alliance. And I know that they definitely, either through their own member contributions or through the way that they work themselves at NATO, definitely want to see a change and have a positive impact on the world. And with that, I would offer that, my perspective has always been there's two ways to shape and change an organization. You can certainly work within it and sort of navigate the bureaucracy to actually see it change, or you can advocate outside of the organization through different think tanks and non-governmental organizations and academia to really do the hard set research to hand over to the organization to then implement. And I think both are very valid and real approaches to the shaping the future of the alliance. And so, I think I would encourage people to look at both options as they look to the future and as we look to shaping NATO for what we want it to be in the future. I think those are two very real and valid paths. So I will say maybe I look forward to working with all of you, and thank you again for this really important panel.
Thank you so much, Cori. And Juxhina, to you.
Thank you so much, Annika. We are today almost 12 years after the old strategic concept of NATO and the current one that we have now, and the world has rapidly changed and a lot have happened since then. From a multipolar and competitive world, we are now facing a war. But as you say, to skip to the good part, let's say, and to be more optimistic, I am glad to be part of this webinar, and I think that this is an example of public discussion and sharing experience and knowledge through a younger generation perspective. And I think that in this strategic competitive world, fragile democracies and threats within internal threats and external threats, I think that one thing remains for sure important: strengthening and fostering our understanding for the transatlantic values and transatlantic bond beyond the traditional approach, but to a more comprehensive approach, and to strengthen our commitment, which is, let's say, the benchmark for guaranteeing our alliance success in the upcoming decade. So Annika, thank you, back to you. And it was a pleasure for me to also be here with Cori and Danielle.
Thank you so much. It was also a pleasure for me. And I would like to thank all of you for joining and for your sharing with us your insightful comments on the future role of NATO. I would also like to thank the US mission to NATO for their support, and also special thanks goes to my colleagues Bruno Lettei and Uliana Kobenko for putting together this wonderful event. So I wish all of you a lovely rest of your day, wherever you may be, and I hope to see you at another GMF event very soon. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.